Okay, so before this video even begins, I just want to say thank you for getting me to over 1,000 subscribers on this YouTube channel. I literally did not think that I was even going to get this far when I started this channel, but here I am. I know it's really cliche and sappy, but I do mean it. So seriously, thank you for all the support. Anyway, on to the actual video. It's tradition now. New year, new challenge, and this time we're covering Skylanders Giants. Skylanders Giants turned 10 years old this year. Well, no, technically not. It's been a couple months. Look, I'm sorry I'm late. It will happen again. If you watched the first video about Spyro's adventure, then most of the same rules apply. I'm still going for 100% collectibles while keeping track of how often an elemental zone and gate appears. Only this time there's one more thing I want to keep track of. How often are you forced to use a giant? The game is Skylanders Giants, so how often are you forced to use them to get 100% completion? There's actually one difference between these runs. I can't really keep track of who's getting the most experience in gold because of the possibility of switching to a giant and all the shops around. If I was to do this challenge, I would have to use only giants or just double the size of the roster that I'd have to use. So instead I just decided I'd play on Nightmare mode. Alright, let's just jump into Chapter 1. So Chapter 1 of Skylanders Giants is actually similar to Chapter 1 of Spyro's Adventure. There aren't any elemental zones within the main level, but the difference here is that there are elemental zones in the elemental gates, but those don't even show up until the latter half of the level. So the first thing to note here is actually the 3 times that I was forced to use a giant for some sort of collectible. One to move this boulder for the soul gem, then one for this chest, as well as the jump off point for this other chest. Then of course there's obviously the life elemental gate as well as the life elemental zone. Wait, guys, watch this.
Bye-bye!
The air elemental gate as well as the air elemental zone. And then the undead elemental gate as well as the undead elemental zone. And then that wraps up the first level. So chapter 2 starts and we immediately get our actual first elemental zone in undead. Yep. Look at all this dead stuff. Okay, but I can't really complain too much. The first game did this too. It's not like the elemental zones have ever made sense anyway. We're also kind of forced to use a giant here. In order to break this wall, you either have to use a bomb or just use a giant. It's definitely easier to use a giant here, but it is possible without one, although it's really difficult. Like, good luck using anyone but Cinder here. Then we get an actual instance of being forced to use a giant with this boulder and then this feat of strength. I'm only counting this as one, since why would I switch back only to switch again? Then there's an earth elemental zone, and then there's a life elemental zone, along with a feat of strength to get this treasure chest. Then when we get to the third set of islands, there is a tech elemental zone, as well as a hidden earth elemental gate and zone, and there is also a hidden fire elemental gate and zone, even if this fire elemental gate is basically just a long hallway with a hat in it. And to close out the level, there is this breakable wall that you need a giant for. There isn't a bomb nearby, and I don't think you can shoot it with the cannons either, so you need a giant to get the soul gem. Once we complete the level, we get to the main hub world of this game, which is Flynn's ship. And there's a thing on the ship that I wanted to talk about as to why I changed a certain rule. So if you remember last time, I was keeping track of how much each Skylander of each element got, how much gold and experience and all that. This is not that easy in this game. I already mentioned that because of how much I'd be switching, I'd either have to use all giants or effectively double the size of the roster. Well, if you remember in the first game, there was that pillar at the core of light that basically gave you 500 to a couple thousand gold each time you broke it. Well, they have something similar here with these doors, except the pattern is the exact same every single time. It just adds a new element every time you come back. Eventually, the 8th element in the sequence, which is Earth, will be getting anywhere from 500 to a couple thousand gold every single time you come back to Flynn's ship, and it respawns every single time you come back. This would obviously tip the numbers in favor of one element over every other element in the game, so that's why I decided to exclude that part of the challenge for this video. Chapter 3 starts off with an air elemental zone, but is soon after followed by an undead elemental gate and as well as an undead elemental zone, and also a breakable wall that only a giant can go through. Later on in the level, past the undead elemental gate, there is a life elemental gate and zone. There's another breakable wall here, but it's kind of difficult to access without a giant, but I'm still not counting it because you can do it, it's just you need specific Skylanders to do it. Then there's a magic elemental zone. Later on in the level, there is also another life elemental gate and elemental zone, making this the first time in the series that I believe there has been 2 elemental gates of the same element in the same level. Following Brock past the gate leads to yet another air elemental zone, and then after Brock destroys the bridge, the area underneath is an undead elemental zone. And this undead elemental zone lasts throughout the rest of the level. Although at the end of the level there's a jump off point, as well as a feat of strength at the end of the cave. Chapter 4 begins with a tech elemental zone. After this there is a life elemental zone, although this is pretty short-lived and mostly consists of playing Skystone, as we are immediately put into a water elemental zone. Off to the side there is also an air elemental gate, which is literally just one island with a hat on it, which I don't even know why it's here, but whatever. Interestingly, there's also an optional feat of strength here. Of course take it, because Skystones is stupid and I hate it. After this there's a fire elemental zone, as well as a bunch of breakable walls. Now, these are all technically optional, and I'm not adding it to the counter, but it is just so much more convenient to just use a giant and break all these walls down. There is also an undead elemental gate and zone. There is also yet another breakable wall within this undead elemental gate, but there is a bomb hidden behind a wall, so it's not impossible to get without a giant. And at the final gauntlet at the end of the level, there is yet another life elemental zone. Chapter 5 is an ice level, which... man, really? Well, whatever. It starts off with a water elemental zone, which,
Yeah, I sure hope it does.
This is pretty short-lived though, as there is a small magic gate nearby. Then there's an air elemental zone, as well as a movable boulder and a feat of strength down this ledge. The elemental zone then switches back to water, and then continues down this chain, but if you go down the other chain, there's a very long fire elemental gate and zone. Then there's a magic elemental zone, as well as this feat of strength, and then the level is complete. Chapter 6 starts off with a turret section! But once that's over with, the first actual elemental zone is Earth. But there is this jump off point once you get to the other side of the dam. Next up is a tech elemental zone, as well as this feat of strength. At the vault itself it turns into a water elemental zone. But a little past the start there's a tech elemental gate and elemental zone. But after that nothing new is introduced and the level is over. Wilkin Village starts off with a magic elemental zone throughout the entire village. Once you leave the village, there's a small earth elemental gate and zone, which is soon followed by a life elemental zone. There is also this random boulder that you have to pick up in order to access this chest and the Lucatron wheel. You must also pick up one of these boulders in order to access the legendary treasure. Once you exit the cave, it becomes an undead elemental zone, as well as there being a feat of strength immediately up the hill. It remains the undead element for the rest of the level. The start of Chapter 8 has a life elemental zone. There are also 2 breakable walls, but there is a bomb nearby for both. There is also a random fire elemental zone in this gas oven! It's an oven. Once you blow up this wall, there's a fire elemental zone, then there's an earth elemental zone and a feat of strength. We also get a water elemental gate and water elemental zone. And I would also like to point out that this is the first water elemental gate in the game, and we're halfway through already. Then for this tower section, it's a tech elemental zone. This is pretty short-lived though, as it immediately switches to an air elemental zone. You also need a giant in order to lift this chaos statue in order to get to Crusher's soul gem. The air elemental zone finishes out the level. Completing Chapter 8 marks the halfway point through the game, and here is what our current stats are looking like. As expected, the starter pack elements are a little higher than all the others. I do find it funny that life has twice as much use as magic so far, but that doesn't really matter. Spyro's Adventure was also pretty lopsided by the time we were at the halfway point, but it eventually evened out towards the end. Chapter 9 begins with a life elemental zone. Once you get to the pool, there is also a feat of strength on the left path. Once you head into the secret passage, it is an undead elemental zone, but immediately to the left there's a tech elemental gate and zone, which is just one room. Going a little farther into the secret passage, there is also a jump off point. Exiting the cave, it becomes a life elemental zone yet again, and I am going to count this as a separate life elemental zone, because even though it's basically in the same area as the main gate, it's still far enough away that I'm willing to count it. Also, it's my video and my rules, so shut up. Going a little farther, there's also a magic elemental gate and zone. Once you enter Chaos's castle, it becomes a tech elemental zone. Going through the left path, it becomes a magic elemental zone. As well as going a little farther in, there is a feat of strength for this chest. Going down the right path is a tech elemental zone, and I'm not going to count this as a separate zone from the main foyer area, simply because 1, it's really short, 2, there's no enemies, and 3, if you took the right path first, it wouldn't change elements anyway. Until you get to the very end, that is, and then it turns into a magic elemental zone. I'm half tempted not to count this because I mean, it's literally just this area right here, and there's no enemies to fight. It's just this push block puzzle. But it does change, so I'll count it. The rest of the level doesn't have an elemental zone because it's just an arena challenge, so let's just move on to the next. Chapter 10 starts by being under attack! Well, the chapter itself actually starts with an air elemental zone. So the way that the level works is that on Flint's ship it's the air element, but once you get onto a different ship it turns into another element. Like once you get onto the ghost ship it becomes an undead elemental zone. There's also this jump point on the ghost ship, as well as this water elemental gate and water elemental zone. While you are in the water elemental zone, you will also need a giant in order to lift one of these boulders in order to get this chest. Once you beat the second awful turret section and board the main ship, it becomes an undead elemental zone. Once you reach the second cannon, it becomes a tech elemental zone. Once you reach this middle section, there's an air elemental gate and zone. Once you reach this final room, it becomes a tech elemental zone again, and stays like that for the rest of the level. Chapter 11 starts the way Chapter 10 ends with a tech elemental zone. A little farther in, you'll also need a giant in order to break this wall. Once you get to Riley's Tube, okay, seriously, why is it called this? It becomes a fire elemental zone. Off to the side on the conveyor belts, there's a life elemental gate and zone, which is kind of weird, but I guess, life, finds a way. Once you're done with the conveyor belts, there's an air elemental zone, as well as a feat of strength. This air elemental zone is pretty short-lived as it pretty much immediately becomes a fire elemental zone. There is also an earth gate and zone here as well. Once you're past the second set of conveyor belts, it becomes a magic elemental zone. Once you get to the lowest level of this area, it becomes a tech elemental zone again. At the shop, there's a jump-off point, but once you get to the bottom, it turns into a magic elemental zone? Well, I guess I have to count this. The boss arena is actually a magic elemental zone, which might be the result of a glitch because I went down to the bottom, but it wouldn't change the rankings anyway, so let's just move on to the next level. Chapter 12 opens with a fire elemental zone. While in the area, there's both a feat of strength and a jump point. Once you're at the bottom of the jump point, however, it changes to the earth element. Getting to the village itself, it becomes an earth elemental zone again. When you get to this random island, it also becomes a magic elemental zone for basically no reason. Well, I gotta count it, I guess. Going down an alternative path, there is an undead elemental gate and zone. Once you get to the far side of the village where the shop is, it turns into the magic element again. So that's twice now that the game has spoiled what elemental zone is coming up next. Once you get into the caves and past this breakable wall, there's a tech elemental gate and zone, which is... Okay, so I'm going to rant about how bad this elemental gate is for how long I stayed in it. Okay, here we go. So the first problem is that it's completely uninspired. Chapter 9 already had a similar gate to this, but this one is even easier and shorter. Not to mention that it isn't really a puzzle, it's just a figure check. A lot of elemental gates in this game have already been like this, but this is by far the worst. It is literally 15 seconds, and that's with me getting hit. And yeah, some gates from the first game weren't great, but at least they had something more than this! Holy shit, I made it in time. After going through this breakable wall, which you don't need a giant for, it becomes an undead elemental zone. But that doesn't last too long either, as there is yet another tech elemental gate and zone. I guess this is a form of apology for us getting a pretty lackluster elemental gate, with this one being actually pretty good. The rest of the level is just the tech element, and then the final part is just an arena battle again. So let's just move on to the next one. I'm going to be tackling Chapter 13 a little differently. Because it's completely non-linear, I'm just going to go over what each trial has individually. The first set of trials has the Trials of Courage. The Trial of Courage Spiders has an undead elemental zone. The Trial of Courage Chompies has a life elemental zone. The second set of trials has the Trials of Heart, and both of them have an air elemental zone, and I am counting these separate because they are two separate sections. The third section of trials has two sets of trials. The first set of trials is the Trials of Valor. One of them has a life elemental zone and the other has a tech elemental zone. And then the second set is the Trial of Elements, one of which has a fire elemental zone and one of which has a water elemental zone. The fourth section similarly has two sets of trials. The Trial of Knowledge Reflection has an earth elemental zone, and the Trial of Knowledge Puzzle has an undead elemental zone. Then the Trial of Strength Power also has an earth elemental zone. The Trial of Strength Power also has a jump-off point. And then the Trial of Strength Speed has a tech elemental zone. Then the fifth set of trials is just a freebie, and there's nothing else for the rest of the level. So Chapter 14 is kind of weird. There isn't really an elemental zone, as the level isn't really continuous. You spend most of the time on the Archean Copter, so most of the time an elemental zone will be on like one of the islands. The first time we even run into an elemental zone is at this undead elemental gate. At this island, there is a water elemental gate and elemental zone. Okay, at this point the game is just laughing at me. I mean, look at this elemental gate. There is literally no puzzle here. It is just a room with a hat in it. The game is just telling you, oops, idiot, I guess you better buy a water Skylander. Well, I guess that comes with the territory for Skylanders. Once you get to the first island where you're forced to stop, it becomes a magic elemental zone. Once you get to the second door, it is an air elemental zone. Once you get to Gearbox, which is currently owning Risk of Rain 2, it becomes a magic elemental zone. Then the final area of the level is a water elemental zone, and then you get on the ship and complete the level. Chapter 15 opens with a magic elemental zone. Randomly at the bottom of this ledge, it becomes an air elemental zone, as well as there being a breakable wall for giants. However, there is a bomb for this, so it doesn't count. There is also a water elemental gate and zone nearby the bomb. Once you get down from this ledge, it becomes an earth elemental zone, and very technically, you don't need a giant in order to break this wall, because there is that bomb nearby, but you would have to be Nostradamus in order to figure out what you need to do with that bomb. However, I'm still not going to count it towards the giant total, because it's not for collectibles, it's just for Skystones. So why would you put yourself through that? Once you push this block into place and get upon this bridge, it becomes a tech elemental zone. There's also 2 breakable walls nearby, but again, there's a bomb nearby, so it doesn't count. Once you hop down this ledge, it becomes a magic elemental zone again, as well as a magic elemental gate that you can activate from above it. Once you get to Caution! Rolling hazards ahead! It becomes an earth elemental zone. A little farther along, there is a fire elemental gate and elemental zone. Once you get past the rolling hazards that are now behind you, it becomes a water elemental zone. Before the level can end, however, there is this random boulder that you have to pick up in order to access this teleporter to get the last treasure of the map. Bringing order to chaos, the final chapter in the game, begins with a water elemental zone. Once getting into this conveyor belt section, it becomes a tech elemental zone, but soon after switches back to the water element because we backtracked to an area previously. There's also yet another tech elemental zone at the bottom of this area, and I'm half tempted not to count this because there's basically nothing here. However, it isn't close enough to the conveyor belt section, so I figured I'd count it anyway. There's also this earth elemental gate and elemental zone here as well. There is also this breakable wall. However, you can use the big ball in order to break the wall. However, it's just really annoying to do it without a giant. So I'm still not going to count it, but it is a lot less convenient. Then it turns into a fire elemental zone. It also randomly becomes the tech elemental zone on this little terrace here, but I'm assuming that's just a glitch and probably just an offshoot of the conveyor belt area. And our final elemental gate is magic once again, similar to the previous game. The rest of the level is just the fire elemental zone from earlier, and the chaos fight itself doesn't have an elemental zone, so that's it. We've beat the game. So here's the final numbers for each elemental zone and elemental gate, and I gotta say, goddamn are these results very different from Spyro's Adventure. If you remember from the last game, it was pretty much even across the board. But in this game, the results are way more lopsided. The elemental zone with the highest total was 18, while the lowest was 11. In the last game, the highest was 14, and the lowest was 10. That is how much different this game is. The elemental gates are also pretty uneven, but that's kind of to be expected. Obviously, it's not as good as Spyro's Adventure's numbers, but it's still pretty solid. The total for the giants was 30, which is about 2 per chapter. It's a little less. That is to be expected, however, considering that some levels are gimmick levels where you're not even on the ground. Not to mention, you can use giants for other things, like using those big boulders and breaking other walls. So even though you don't need a giant, this number would be a lot higher if I was counting the number of cases where you actually can use a giant. This number would be a lot lower, however, if I was counting the amount of times that you are forced to use a giant to progress. It's because the number would be 0. It's 0 times. You are never actually forced to use a giant to progress, more than likely because the devs figured if you didn't have one, then how are you going to beat the game? And they didn't want to actually force you to go out and buy it. So if you literally just have Spyro, you can beat this game. Which, you know, good on the devs for that. First elemental gate being life makes sense. T-Rexes is literally the guy that they used for this game. He's in the starter pack. He's in the Portal Owners pack. He's literally everywhere. Obviously, it was going to be life. What I wasn't expecting to be last, however, was water. I had already mentioned earlier in the video that water doesn't show up until Chapter 8, which is halfway through the game. It's also one of the starter pack elements for the first game, so I'm genuinely surprised that this one showed up this late. First actual elemental zone being undead also makes sense. Cinder is one of the starter pack Skylanders and she's undead. Fire being the last elemental zone to appear makes sense because fire isn't in either of the starter packs, so it makes sense not to see it. Is that the end of the video? Well, no, because technically there are still 4 more levels that I haven't talked about. What levels am I talking about? Well, the Spyro's Adventure packs can also be played in Giants. And what does it change? Not much. Honestly, the rich get richer in this one. Tech and Magic stay in the lead with 19, while Undead has 18, and the gap between first and last decreases by 1. So I guess in the end it did really even out. Although Fire is still in last place with a mere 13, which is a whole 6 less than first place, which is kind of insane, honestly. Obviously the Giants number doesn't change because the adventure packs weren't built with the Giants in mind, so that number doesn't change at all. I'm kind of genuinely surprised that Life and Air didn't appear more in this game because, again, they're both starter pack elements, but a lot of that was front-loaded. I noticed in this game that a lot of the elemental zones were more sectioned off. So you get a lot of Life and Air towards the beginning, but then a lot more Tech, Magic, and Undead towards the end. Although Undead even stopped appearing towards the end as well. It was kind of surprising, but I guess the last level in Spyro's Adventure also did a similar thing where they did a lot of fire elemental zones. I'll definitely be doing one of these for Swap Force as well as a tier list for Swap Force. I can't really say when. I don't know if I'll be doing it for the anniversary or earlier, but honestly at the rate that this video came out, I probably want to do it sometime in August so I can actually get it out on time. There should also be another Skylanders Giants video coming out. I don't know if it's going to be the next one. I said the same thing about the Kingdom Hearts video, and that hasn't come out yet, and it probably never will. So the next Skylanders Giants video should be just like a highlight reel of my playing through Nightmare Mode while severely intoxicated. It might be a little while before that one comes out. There's like 20 hours of footage that I gotta sit through, and it might not even be the next video that comes out because I gotta play Fire Emblem Engage while it's still hot. But be sure to be on the lookout for more Skylanders content in the future. Anyways, let me know what you thought about this video in the comments below. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and have a great rest of your day.